Okay, so welcome everybody to our first in the series of September seminars just before the Chagim. And I think that they're all going to be really so different and so lovely. Tonight we have Naomi, and next week we have Danielle Lockwood talking about her father, Herbert Kretzmer, who wrote the music for Les Miserables and and that's going to be also lovely, as well as the week thereafter will be Richard Mendelssohn talking about Paro, his research, his book, and that's how we're going to spend September. So let's get started. Tonight's speaker is Naomi Schamroth Rapeport, who was the first woman clinician in private practice in Johannesburg, where she was active and honored in medicine and medical politics, uniting clinicians of all races. She's married to cardiologist Colin Schamroth, the son of Professor Leo Schamroth, and mother of cardiologist and financial analyst daughters. Since retirement, Naomi has volunteered at the South African Jewish Museum Archives and was also an advisor to Mark Wade and Alan Swerdlow, who produced the film series Legends and Legacies. For the past 3 years, she has been collating the profiles of over 3,000 Jewish South African men and women who served in the Second World War for the Chaim Herzog Museum in Latrun, Israel. She's also written about the Jewish doctors who contributed to Baragwanath Hospital. So welcome to Naomi, and I'm so happy she's going to be talking to us now. Naomi, you can unmute yourself and go ahead. And questions, there'll be time for questions after Naomi's talk. Thank you, and welcome once again.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Geraldine. I'm going to speak tonight about the South African World War II Jewish veterans' role in the fledgling state of Israel. And as Gail said, I'm actually working as a volunteer for the Chaim Herzog Museum of the Jewish Soldier of World War II, which has recently opened in Latrun. It's a state-of-the-art museum. Unfortunately, it hasn't yet officially been opened because of the war, and President Herzog, whose father Chaim Museum is named after, would like the war to end before we have an official opening. But anyone who comes to Israel and can, it's really a must-see. Now, during the Second World War, there were 1.5 million Jewish soldiers who partook in the war. The majority actually came from countries where there were big Jewish communities, such as the US, the USSR, and in fact, Poland as well. And then the rest were really made up of people from a lot of the Commonwealth countries. Now, South Africa actually contributed 10,000 Jewish volunteers. And I use the word volunteers because South Africa was the country where you were not recruited or drafted. You actually had to volunteer to serve in the war. So people who volunteered actually were extremely dedicated to the war effort. There have been at least 2 publications about the roles that the South Africans played in the war. The first one is the booklet on the left, which is They Fought for South Africa. And this was written by actually a flight sergeant, Julius Sack, in 1946. And then in 1950, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies was responsible for publishing the little blue book, as they call it, which was the book on South African Jews in World War II. And many of them actually had an illustrious career in the war. Now, after the war, everyone actually received a letter from Smuts, who was the defense minister. And in it, he wrote that you volunteered for military service. You made the sacrifice for South Africa and for the wider cause of world freedom. And there's no doubt about that. In fact, not only the South Africans, but every Jewish soldier who served. Now, South Africans were very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist is actually the correct word. And in 1948, there was a call for volunteers to assist the fledgling state of Israel. A documentary was produced in 2001 and 2011, and I'm just going to show you quickly the trailer about it because this gives you an introduction as to what the South Africans did with Israel.
In 1948, the population of the newly declared State of Israel was about 650,000. Following the declaration of the state.
Sorry if it slipped.
In 1948, the population of the newly declared State of Israel was about 650,000. Following the declaration of the state, they were immediately attacked from all sides by 6 Arab armies. With scant military supplies, limited combat experience, and an influx of Holocaust survivors, the native Israelis desperately needed help.
The idea of Israel then was something that had a lot of sympathy in South Africa.
And they realized that the chips were really down. We weren't supposed to, you were not allowed, as South Africans, you weren't allowed to fight in a foreign army. You could get into trouble.
As the boat came in, the lights of the Carmel went on, and all these new immigrants from Nazi Europe started to sing Hatikva.
They hadn't been formed into a complete army yet, and they didn't know how to cope, which units to put us into. It was like a Wild West comedy. Big base of the airport and the medical services and radar with South Africans. 92 non-Jews were amongst the 425. They were 21% of the aircrafts. Without the Air Force, we would never have survived the War of Independence.
So I'm going to be speaking about these volunteers. In fact, South African volunteers formed the largest single national group. Those 804 represented 3 times more than those that British Jewry contributed and 50 times higher than American Jewry. And one of the reasons for this high rate of service was this tradition of volunteering. And also South Africa was a society that was racially polarized. Jews were actually made to feel Jews in South Africa. There'd been a lot of anti-Semitism in South Africa before the Second World War. And in fact, the nationalist government was certainly anti-Semitic. But the interesting thing about the South African government in 1948, which was the Nationalist Party regime, they actually wanted to humiliate the Brits and see them withdraw from their historic position of influence in the Middle East. And in South Africa, there were mass rallies held in Johannesburg and Cape Town, trying to recruit volunteers. Military camps were actually set up, which operated without any cover. And by the end of 1948, there were still 2,200 South Africans undergoing training, getting ready to come to Israel. As you heard in the video, contributions that were made were predominantly in the Air Force, in radar and medical services, and I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail. Now, Boris Sr. was a RAF pilot in the Second World War, and he had actually gone to Palestine in December 48 and joined the air service, Shirut Avier. But he was then sent back to South Africa to come and recruit air and ground crew and actually buy aircraft. And he set up a dummy airline company in Johannesburg, and he transferred to Palestine 3 Dakota transports and some other aircraft and armaments. And when the call went out for volunteers, the pilots, air gunners, radio operators, mechanics, all these men actually assumed that there would be planes to fly, guns to shoot, radios to operate, and workshops with equipment. But the reality was different. In fact, the Shirut Avir had managed to get hold of 20 RAF Oyster aircraft that the RAF had sold as scrap in January of 48, and they took these aircraft and actually went ahead and built 18 planes. And this was the planes that the Israeli Air Force started off with. And although there were Royal Air Force stations in the Mandate of Palestine, they were not in the control of the Haganah. And what actually happened was that the first squadron that was set up at Stade Dov Airport outside Tel Aviv. This is a photograph in 1948 showing you what the airport consisted of tents. And in fact, the radio control tower was actually a wooden box. Now, the first officer in command of the squadron was Boris Senior, and he had the small inventory of these Oysters. In fact, there were 2 Beechcraft aircraft that had been flown up from South Africa. He had piloted one, and another pilot, Cyril Katz, had flown another one up. And they had a few other aircraft that were smuggled out. And 95% of the air crew who served with Macha were from Anglo-Saxon countries. So the official language of the Air Force was actually English. And because there were so many South Africans, in fact, and there was no voice encryption to hide communications, pilots and control towers actually conversed in Afrikaans to talk about their communications. Now, Friday the 14th, 1948 is an auspicious day in the history of Israel. On that morning, South African pilot Cyril Katz and an American pilot Percy Tolchinsky, who subsequently became known as Pesach Tar, were sent out from Stade Dov Airport on a Dakota to go down to the northern Dead Sea to a settlement to evacuate women and children to Tel Aviv and Haifa. In fact, they did 3 trips throughout the day. On that same day, South African pilot Lionel Arya Kaplan with the navigator Cyril Steinberg actually flew to the RAF base Akir, which was near Rehovot, which had just come into the possession of the Haganah. And they went to try and salvage navigation and bombing equipment. And they found everything had been destroyed by the RAF. In fact, when they were flying back to Tel Aviv, they spotted some RAF Spitfires flying over this town or the city. That afternoon, Boris Senior, together with newly arrived Harold Smokey Simon, these 2 men went up in this Beechcraft that Senior had brought from South Africa, had smuggled in from South Africa, and they did the first reconnaissance flight in Israel, and they saw hundreds of trucks and armored cars moving westwards towards Palestine. They were 3 miles east of the Allenbury Bridge, and there were fires on the 2 kibbutzim in the Kafar Etzion block. And while all these 3 activities were being undertaken, in fact, Ben-Gurion was reading the Declaration of Independence at the Tel Aviv Museum. And in fact, these men were not even aware that this was happening. But the next day, the day after the declaration of the state, at first light, Cyril Katz and Percy Tolchinsky returned to Stade Dov Airport because they had promised that they would evacuate further people from the Dead Sea, and they were in the Dakota ready to take off when the Royal Egyptian Air Force began dive bombing the airfield. They strapped the airfield, and fortunately the 2 men managed to run out of the aeroplane and they hid on the side of the sea. And after the attack, they went back onto the airfield where there were stretcher bearers carrying men into ambulances. In fact, one of those wounded was a South African who was an armorer. He was responsible for loading up the arms on the plane. Fortunately, he suffered only from shock and no major injury. In fact, while the strafing was occurring, Myra Simpson, who was the wife of Harold Simpson, was on her way to report to Stadorf together with South African pilot Leslie Shagam. They were on a jeep getting ready to cross the bridge at the Reading Power Station to Stadorf. When they were strafed, they managed to jump into a ditch and took shelter in an actual shed which was occupied by camels. And once it was all over, they actually went back and then went on to work. Unfortunately, the meteorological hut was untouched. As Myra Simon said, she was put to shift work as the meteorological observer. But one thing did happen during this attack. There was a British mechanic who managed to shoot down one of the Egyptian Spitfires using a 20mm machine gun, and the plane actually crashed on Herzliya Beach, and the pilot was taken prisoner of war. This plane was subsequently salvaged. Now, the Egyptian Air Force actually could attack Israel with impunity. There were no Israeli fighter aircraft to intercept them. There was only some ground fire. And over the next 6 days, the Egyptian Air Force continued to attack Tel Aviv, causing civilian casualties. On the 18th of May, they actually attacked the central bus station. 42 people were killed and 100 were actually wounded. And the Israelis had no way to counteract these attacks. In fact, the Egyptian Air Force even went ahead on the 22nd of May and attacked the Ramat David airfield near Haifa. They didn't realize it actually was under the RAF still, and they then apologized for this unfortunate incident because they had thought it would been taken over by the Israelis. In fact, a few days later, the RAF left Palestine. Now, the way the Israelis counterattacked the Egyptians was what they called spit piper raids. They fitted out these little aircraft, in fact, with night flying instruments. It was done by a South African air mechanic, Jack Koppel Isaacson. The air gunners were replaced by bomb chuckers. These were men who actually took the bombs and held them on their laps, and when they reached the target, the pilot would flick on a torch and the bomb chuckers would then release the safety pins and drop these bombs out of the window or the door. In fact, there weren't even enough bombs, and what they did was they even threw out empty bottles which emitted a whistle which sounded like a bomb. And these spit piper raids took place over the Arab Legion positions around Jerusalem, Nablus, and Istud. And in fact, these little planes have been commemorated in 1967. A gold coin was minted in honor of the role they played in Israel, and a stamp was actually printed. Now, in terms of the first combat aircraft Israel received, these were aircraft that they got from Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was the only friend of Israel. And these Avia 1996 aircraft had been built actually by Czechoslovakia for the Luftwaffe. They were based on the Messerschmitts. And Israel managed to buy aircraft. And these aircraft then formed what was called 101 Squadron. And 4 of them arrived in Israel intact. And what actually happened on the 29th of May, these aircraft undertook their first operation. What was happening was that the Egyptian army had actually reached up to Istud, which we know as Ashdod, 30 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. And the Givati Brigade was under tremendous pressure, and they asked the Air Force to help. And 4 pilots went up. Lou Leonard, who was an American, he's shown at the top. The second one was Mordechai Alon. He actually happened to be the squadron leader. He was from Israel. Isa Weitzman was also from Israel. In fact, Alon and Weitzman had been taught by the RAF in Zimbabwe. That's where they qualified as pilots, or Rhodesia as it was known that day. And the 4th pilot was Eddie Cohen from South Africa. Unfortunately, Cohen's plane was hit and his plane crashed and he died. Leonard's plane was badly damaged, and Alon's plane also was damaged upon landing. But the importance of this actual attack was it was a shock to the Egyptian soldiers when they saw with their own eyes that Israel now had an air force. And the Egyptian offenses was halted 30 kilometers south of Tel Aviv, and they never advanced any further into Israel. Now, the first attack that took place on Damascus, Syria, was undertaken by Cyril Katz, Les Chimes, and the navigator was Harold Smokey Simon. All South Africans, and their bomb chuckers were Israelis. And I'm going to just read to you what Cyril Katz wrote about this particular attack. They took off in the early hours of the morning at 2:15 on June the 11th, heavily loaded with bombs, in fact, overloaded. The fellows did not know anything about a center of gravity and how to load a bomb. The Israelis see an empty space and load it as if with carrots. Anyway, he managed to get the plane up, and they managed to fly over the Galil, over Mount Hermon, and there was Damascus beautifully lit up. We dropped one lot of bombs and lights went out. Perhaps the power station decided to switch off. There was a lot of confusion. But at the end, most of the city was in darkness when we left. We had dropped all our bombs. In fact, Harold Simon wrote that they did 6 runs over the city. Not only did they drop bombs, but they also dropped empty crates of bottles because they didn't have enough bombs. And Time magazine reported afterwards that the Israeli aircraft flew over Damascus. In fact, it was only one plane, our Dakota, and we were over target for 25 minutes. It seemed like 2 hours. But the importance of this particular attack was that the Syrians understood that night that their capital was not immune from attack. Now, the first proper bombers that arrived came in July 1948. They were the B-17 Flying Fortresses. 4 were smuggled out of the US and sent to Czechoslovakia. One was actually impounded by the Portuguese authorities in the Azores because of pressure from the American government. And in Czechoslovakia, these 3 bombers were then fitted with bomb racks and guns and bombed up for action. And they then were flown to Israel, where they formed a new squadron known as 69 Squadron Hapatishim, known as the Hammers, and these were based at the Ramat David Air Force Base. And here is a photograph of one of the crews of the B-17 bombers. And in fact, if you look at the bottom row, kneeling, we have the second man here, David Judas, South African, a navigator. We have Sigmar Din, a radio operator, and George Meissen, who was an air gunner. And not to miss an opportunity, in fact, when these bombers were flown to Israel, they undertook Operation Nabut, where they went and carried out a bombing raid on Cairo. And in fact, Boris Senior wrote that he was unable to locate any good maps of Cairo, and he utilized tourist maps to plan the raid. And the raid on Cairo actually was successful. The bombs straddled the targets he had chosen, But the most important thing about these raids was that they could retaliate for the raids on Tel Aviv by reaching Cairo, and they caused panic in Egypt. And despite minimal damage, it was a big moral booster for us. In fact, Manny Feldman, who was the leading navigator on the 3 bombers, wrote about an attack they undertook over Gaza, which was reported on the BBC 36 hours later, where they had written or reported that the Israeli Air Force blackened the sky with heavy bombers. And Feldman said, at most, there must have been no more than 7 aircraft. I realized the Egyptian Air Force and the Egyptian anti-aircraft were British trained, and in some cases British manned. How did they explain to the British public that this miserable little Air Force penetrated their air defense? Now, all of us know about Colonel Cecil Margot. He was a distinguished pilot in the Second World War, having received the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Distinguished Service Order. And he was actually invited by being to Israel and to help in organizing the Air Force. In fact, this is the letter that was given to him to present to the Air Force commanders. Margot was actually also accompanied by another veteran whose name was Trevor Sussman, who had served with him in number 24 Squadron in the Second World War and had also received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Now, Margot interviewed many people who were serving in the Air Force, and he concluded that there was a grave lack of organization in the Israeli Air Force, which was not surprising because the Air Force had started up with nothing, actually. And he presented a very sophisticated and a professional program for improvements and reconstruction. A lot of them were really unrealistic because they never had the finances. But he did appoint Dov Judo, who had actually served with him in number 24 Squadron in the Second World War. And Judo became the director of operations of the Air Force, and Harold Simon was the chief of air operations. Margot actually left 3 weeks later, and these men continued running the Air Force. Now, you cannot run an Air Force if you don't have a technical crew. And not a single plane was lost due to bad maintenance. And I'm going to highlight 2 veterans who served as technical crew. One was Tuvia Zimmerman, who was originally from Wynberg, and he served with 101 Squadrons, actually involved in keeping those Avias and subsequently Spitfires in the sky. And he was known as a perfectionist, the man we needed. He would drive people. He drove himself harder than anyone else. He worked with veterans Isaac Greenberg and Chaim Grevler. Another one was Abraham Harry Nurek, who came from Uppington, and he was based at the Ramat David base looking after the bombers. And it was written that he became one of the 10,000 human reasons why Israel won the war. New plugs were hard to come by, and we used reconditioned ones. We changed them more often than we changed our socks. There was no time to change our socks. We had to find the time to change the plugs. And he wrote that when he would doze off at night, he went over the work that he had done in the day, and if he wasn't sure it had been properly done, he would actually return to the airfield if he couldn't record the job and continue the work. And you will remember the Spitfire that was shot down on the 15th of May on the beach of Herzliya. This aircraft was taken to Tel Aviv, and it was actually rebuilt. You can see the crew who rebuilt this plane. And in fact, its test flight was undertaken by Boris Senior, who had been responsible originally for recruiting most of the South Africans. And Boris Senior wrote a book called New Heavens, using that photograph actually for the front cover of his book, and it was about his life as a fighter pilot and a founder of the Israeli Air Force. There was another pilot who actually was involved in rebuilding an aircraft, and this was Sidney Chalmers. He was involved in rebuilding a Mosquito plane, which was used for reconnaissance. It had crashed at Ramat David. And an interesting thing about Sidney Chalmers was that he actually died in 1955 while serving with El Al. He was aboard an El Al plane that entered into Bulgarian space, and the plane with the crew and passengers was shot down by the Bulgarians. But he had contributed in the Second World War and certainly contributed in terms of the Israeli Air Force. Now let's talk about 505 Squadron radar. During the British Mandate, no Palestinian Jews were allowed to work on radar, and all the equipment was destroyed prior to the departure of the British. But fortunately, amongst the early volunteers were radar veterans, and they formed this unit. In fact, Morris Ittenberg, or known as Moshe Eitan, was the officer in command. He had been a radar engineer who taught at the radar school in Brooklyn, New York, and his second in command was South African Charles Broider, who had been an engineer in the Second World War and had actually gone to work at the Weizmann Institute. Now, there were 3 South Africans who had served in the Special Signals Service, which was part of the South African Corps of Signals, as radio technicians in the Second World War. And these 3 men went on a course at the University of the Witwatersrand, where they were taught how to design and construct their own radar equipment. And these transmitters were known as JB after Johannesburg. And the 3 men kept their notes and diagrams. And when they came to Israel as volunteers, these notes were smuggled in the suitcase of Max Barlin. And they were then used to help build the equipment at Rehovot from bits and pieces that were salvaged from the deliberately damaged and abandoned RAF equipment. And Morris Ostroff, who had also been a war veteran, was a radio ham, and he was involved in actually helping design a large array of the antennae for the radar sets. And here is a photograph. On the left is they called them the Weizmann whiz men. Kneeling at the bottom is Charles Broider. In the middle is actually Morris Ostroff, and the young little man there is Max Barlin, in whose suitcase the documents were smuggled to Israel. The other photograph here is Morris Ostroff with that little hat on his head, assisting them building the antenna for the radar equipment. Now, 505's Squadron radar was then moved to a base near Rishon LeZion, and Reuben Joffe was made the chief technical officer and base commander. Jack Siegel was put in charge of operations, and another South African, Abe Golders, who came from Bloemfontein, was put in charge of the electrical and mechanical workshops. And the workshop, together with the radar department, were responsible for building transportable radar stations to deploy along the coast to protect Tel Aviv and Haifa. Joffe actually conducted the first radar technical training course at Sarona, where he actually taught 15 radar technicians, and Siegel, assisted by Jette Golombek, were involved in training women as radio operators in Haifa. They used dummy models of radar sets to train these women. And here is a photograph of the mobile radar station Geffen. In fact, Sid Sutner, another war veteran, had the brainwave of converting some electrical motors they had to help generate power for these radar stations. Now, I just want to tell you a little story about the Geffen radar station, about Barney Dworsky. He actually had been a sapper in the Second World War, serving in the engineering corps, and he broke his back in Italy, in Naples, in 1944. He spent a year paralyzed, having surgery, but he vowed he was going to learn to walk, which he did. And he went to volunteer for Macha and was refused by the South African Zionist Fed. So he actually paid for his fare to Israel. And he worked at the Geffen mobile station. Now, in the month of October 1948, there was a reconnaissance plane that flew over Israel daily. It flew so high that they couldn't actually really distinguish it. And on the 20th November, it was a Saturday, Dworsky, together with an Israeli, Abba Babitz, were actually at the station when they tracked this aircraft. They plotted it, they sent information to the filter room, which was being headed by Jette Golombek, and they then continued to track this plane. And a non-Jewish American pilot was sent up in a Mustang to actually intercept the plane as it flew actually towards Ashdod. And he obviously did intercept it because the plane turned to the sea and burst into flames and crashed off the coast of Ashdod. Now, the importance of this plane actually was discussed on the 16th of December 1948 in the House of Commons in England, where the Air Commodore Harvey asked the Secretary of State for Air, Mr. Arthur Henderson, about a missing Mosquito aircraft that went missing on the 20th of November 1948. And Henderson replied, well, it had been reported actually on the Israeli broadcasts and the Israeli press. And Air Commodore Harvey asked what was actually its flight plan at the time. And Henderson replied, well, it was a photographic reconnaissance flight, unarmed, of course, and it was on a training flight. But Mr. Anthony Eden realized what was going on, and he said, could the Secretary of State for Air tell us a little bit more about how this could have happened? Is he aware where the aeroplane was? Surely it could not have been on a photographic flight over an area where, to put it mildly, the international situation is extremely tense. And in fact, this aircraft had been based between Iraq and Egypt and was filtering information back to the Iraqis and the Egyptian forces. Now let's go on to the South African doctors. Chaim Sheba was the chief medical officer of the IDF, and he became a huge admirer of the South African jury because South African doctors not only saved hundreds of lives, but like the men in the Air Force, they also created something out of nothing. Now, here is a chart of all the volunteers who served in the medical services. There were 281. And in red here is highlighted the South Africans. 51 South Africans volunteered, the largest from all the other countries, including Britain, the US, etc. Similarly, amongst nurses, similarly amongst other medical personnel. South Africans made up the majority. Now, the first to actually come and assist was Arthur Jacob Helfert. He was an orthopedic surgeon, originally from Cape Town, who during the Second World War had been sent to Sierra Leone, and then he was sent to the Middle East. And when he was in the Middle East, based in Cairo, he toured the military hospitals, including the Mandate of Palestine. And he was invited by Dr. Chaim Yaski, who was the director of Hadassah Medical Organization, to see orthopedic patients at Hadassah. Now, in 1948, on the 13th of April, the Hadassah Medical Convoy massacre took place, where staff going to the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus were ambushed and all 78 personnel were murdered, including Chaim Yasky. In fact, Halford left a few days later to come and organize the accident services, and he carried with him 200 pounds of surgical instruments to assist the medical corps. There were other orthopedic surgeons who subsequently came. One was Dr. Leon Gillis, also a South African who during the Second World War had been based in England, actually at the Birkenhead Municipal Hospital, which had been a target of heavy German bombing raids, and he learned traumatic surgery, and he then was posted to Queen Mary's Hospital to take care of ex-servicemen. And he became a world authority on amputations. He was the first to realize that if you had to amputate a soldier's limb, you needed to ensure that you could fit an artificial prosthesis, and you also needed to go ahead and plan the process of rehabilitation. And he came to assist in Israel. We had Cyril Jacob Kaplan. He was from Durban. He had served originally at Orabi Military Hospital in Natal during the war, and then in North Africa. And when he was also in North Africa, he took equipment across to Palestine, which had been captured from German stores. And he came to Israel, and he set up the orthopedic department at number 10 Military Hospital, Haifa, which today we know as Rambam Hospital. Lionel Meltzer was a highly decorated soldier. He had received the Military Cross in the Second World War at the Battle of Sidi Rezeg. And then in Italy, he received the OBE. In fact, it was recorded that he once stripped off his badges to help a stretcher bearer bring patients to the field ambulance. And he had been Michael Comey, who also was a World War veteran, who had asked him to assist in recruiting volunteers. And Meltzer came. They arrived with a group of medical personnel on the 25th of June. It was a month after the state had been declared. And he was appointed Deputy Director of Medical Services by Chaim Sheba, and he introduced the field ambulance system. And it was stated that with little knowledge of Hebrew, he nagged, he cajoled, and he bullied the military authorities into rustling up beds and medical supplies. He traveled the length and the breadth of the country at the height of the war, inspecting hospitals and field medical facilities. And he, in fact, was asked by Sheba subsequently to take over the medical corps headquarters. Jack Penn was instrumental in helping with reconstructive and plastic surgery. In the Second World War, he had set up the Brenthurst Military Hospital in Johannesburg to operate on war injured, and he was the head of plastic surgery at Wits University. And he came to Israel numerous times in 1948. He was actually assisted by Isaac Kaplan, who'd actually worked in intelligence in the war and then qualified as a doctor after the war and came in 1948 and served at Hadassah. But every time Penn came, Kaplan would actually assist him to treat the war casualties. And Isaac Penn subsequently became a professor emeritus of plastic surgery in Israel. Here is a photograph of Jack Penn in front of the Rambam Hospital. He's sitting there in the middle with the black shirt. The man on his right actually was Jack Wilton, another surgeon, and the other doctor there, Dr. Leo Borenstein, was actually from Israel originally and became a professor of plastic surgery. And here we can see them with patients that they'd operated on during the war. Another important person was Louis Miller. Now, Louis Miller had served as a psychiatrist to the Cape Colored Corps in the war, and then was assigned to Italy in the 6th South African Armored Division as a psychiatrist. He actually worked together with Lionel Meltzer. And he came here to Israel, and he established psychiatric and psychological services in the IDF and the Israeli Air Force. And he stated that much of the experience which I'd gained in the South African Army, we learned much about battle exhaustion and things related to it, morale, human relationships, group cohesion, and so on. And he was responsible for setting up the first psychiatric program to deal with soldiers who were suffering from battle exhaustion, or else known as shell shock, and today what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Just a few other doctors. It's impossible to mention all 51, but we had Victor Reznikov, known as Bunny Reznikov. He was stationed in Haifa. He was a radiologist and became a pioneer radiologist in Israel. Harry Feldman was a medical officer in the Air Force with 101 Squadron and the Squadron at Ramat David, and became the chief medical officer in the Israeli Air Force in 1948. He returned to South Africa and became a general practitioner. We have Mary Gordon, the only woman who actually served as a doctor, volunteer. She had actually come to Israel in 1946 and was sent to Palestine, to be correct, and was sent to Cyprus, to the refugee camps, looking after the Jewish refugees. She was known as Mother Mary, and during the War of Independence was a consultant physician to number 5 military hospital, Tel Levinsky, which we today know as Tel HaShomer or Chaim Sheba Hospital. Jack Wilton, I mentioned, was the surgeon who also assisted Jack Penn. And we had Abram Kessler, who was a neurosurgeon, and he worked with the Carmeli Brigade. Now, I just want to mention 3 other points before I finish. I need to mention Basil Levine. He had been a sapper in the South African Engineering Corps, had been injured in the war, and he actually volunteered in 1948 to come to Israel. His brother Stanley was a medical officer for the Givati Brigade. And Basil Levine was in charge of the defenses in the south. Now, Beersheba had been under siege by the Egyptians. As I told you, the Egyptians had advanced all the way up to Ashdod, and Beersheba actually was under siege. And he was the South African whose role in the Beersheba victory was perhaps the largest of any of the South African volunteers. He led the sapper unit charged with making a gap in the minefields that the Egyptians had laid in the wadis and the road leading to Beersheba, and was responsible for actually relieving the siege. And here's the gentleman with the pipe in his mouth in the 2 photographs, the top photographs with his brother and his father, and the bottom with 2 other mechanics. Now, unfortunately, in every war, there are people who sacrifice their lives, and there were 7 South Africans. The first 2, Chatsi Berelowitz and Zvi Lipschutz, were actually killed at Kafai Etzion before the state was declared, 2 days before and a day before the state was declared. Gideon Rosenberg was killed in the Jerusalem corridor on the 16th of May, Meir Selber at Kibbutz Ramat Rachel. 2 of our war veterans were Eddie Cohen, who I told you was shot down during the operation of Squadron 101 at Istud on the 29th of May, and another war veteran was Lionel Morris Bloch, who was killed on the Syrian border on the 10th of July. The last one was Louis Hack, who had served in the Western Galilee. And unfortunately, with war, we also have a problem of prisoners of war. And there were 2 South African war veterans who were taken prisoner of war. One of them was Beryl Monty Goldberg, who had been an air photographer during the Second World War. And on the 14th of August, he was on a flight with the Israeli pilot Maklef when they had to crash land in the Egyptian-held Beit Guvrim area on their way home from a mission. They were captured by the Bedouins and handed over to the Egyptians. The other one was Jack Fleisch, He had also been seriously wounded in the Second World War in an artillery attack in Italy and had spent a year in hospital. And he volunteered in 48 with Chayota Negev. It was a fighting unit, and he was a demolition expert. And he unfortunately was taken prisoner of war when the Israelis were trying to get hold of an important fortress known as Iraq al-Sudwan. And both of these men ended up in the Abbasia prison camp. The man on the right with the cravat is Beryl Monty Goldberg, and the man kneeling is Jack Flash. Fortunately, both of them ended up being released, but suffered the traumas of having been a prisoner of war. And in fact, Jack Flash never actually came to terms with the experience he had had as a prisoner of war. This is a photograph of Monty Goldberg returning home from captivity. So I've spent the last 3/4 of an hour or so telling you about our South African World War II veterans who played a vital role in the fledgling state of Israel and who all helped to contribute something out of nothing. And I just want to quote the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He said that the Machar volunteers were not mercenaries. They were Jewish patriots expecting no reward other than to see the battle through and the state of Israel secure. Some were non-Jews who felt our battle for freedom was theirs too. If we failed to defend ourselves, there would be no survivors, no Israel, and no Jewish national future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really a wonderful account, and how relevant it is today. You can actually unshare your screen now, and I really thank you for that marvelous presentation. And I'm sure there must be questions. As we said before, Naomi is quite an expert about, collating the profiles of over 3,000 South African men and women, and I believe also from Rhodesia, not only South Africa, right, Naomi, as somebody mentioned. So if you could just unshare your screen, and then we can have questions.
Shops.
You know how to do that?
There you go.
There we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Right. I know that many of you have also had, relatives who were volunteers also in Second World War from South Africa. But this was particularly about Palestine, or now Israel. So anybody has some questions? There have been some nice remarks here, how they enjoyed your talk, Naomi.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
As Gail, you said, what we're living through in Israel now is unfortunately very similar to what they experienced in 48. But in 48, there was nothing. The state actually had nothing. At least we have some resources here.
Yeah. And it was also very, very significant and interesting how many South Africans in my field, which is the medical field, volunteered to come to Israel or to Palestine and to help. That was unbelievable, really, actually, when you think about it.
Correct. In fact, a lot of them came and then they left and then they came back. So for example, Smokey Simon, they went back to South Africa, and then in 1963 they came back to Israel. So not everyone who volunteered remained here, but many of them did come back in later years, actually.
That's true. Okay, any questions? Maybe you could just sort of, I know that I've referred many people onto you about their relatives who served in the Second World War, and your work at the museum itself.
So let me just give you a few minutes about the museum.
Okay.
The museum actually the original idea of the museum was set up over 20 years ago. And it's a part of history that's been completely neglected about Jewry, because everyone thinks of the Second World War purely as the Shoah and the tragedy of the Shoah. But they don't realize the role that these soldiers actually played in helping to defeat the Nazis. And as I said, it was 1.5 million who actually served. 250,000 actually died serving with the Allied forces. And the museum has been set up to actually honor them. The majority actually were the Russians, and the majority who were killed in the war were actually the Russian Jews as well. The Americans made up 500,000. And what is interesting about the Americans, if you visit the museum, you will find that many of them actually weren't really promoted to high ranks in the American army. Whereas in the British army, and certainly those who served in the South African army, we had many who were promoted and received awards for the work that they actually did in the war. Yeah. So the museum is open. You can actually, I can send you the details. You just put in on Google the Chaim Herzog Museum of the Jewish Soldier of Second World War. You will find the address there. The website is in 3 languages: Hebrew, Russian, and English. And you can choose either language, whichever one you want to actually look up about soldiers. I was actually contacted by the curator-director Zwika Kantor in Johannesburg to help assist, because originally they only had the names of about 20 South Africans. And what was interesting is that Zwika Kantor had actually been in South Africa. He had been serving as the military attaché at the Israeli embassy when we had change of government in South Africa. So he was aware of the South African community. And when he phoned me, I got involved, and we listed all those who died. There were quite a lot of resources available that one can use. You could also try and get documents from the South African archives. That's quite difficult at times to access. Sorry, just hang on a moment. Just hang on. Colin, mute. Sorry. So we actually, you can go onto the South African archives and you can get documents. There are people who you can pay to get the documents. But the most important documents we've actually got are from people whose parents made diaries or kept memorabilia. In fact, on the CHOL website, you've got the diary that it was Harris Green, Tzvi Green, did about his father, Solomon Green, who was a sapper in the war and served in North Africa and was injured at the Battle of Gazala. That's actually on the CHOL website. We've got quite a lot of other documents on the website of the museum, diaries of people that have been compiled. We try and ask the family to give us a bit of information, but unfortunately, most soldiers did not discuss their war experience with their families. It was too traumatic. They didn't want to share with them the experiences they were exposed to. A lot of them suffered from post-traumatic stress. The families didn't realize it, but in fact they did. And therefore they didn't really tell their children. But it doesn't matter, as long as we get their names and we can then go ahead and actually go and commemorate them, because each and every soldier in our eyes is actually a hero, because each and every soldier contributed to getting rid of the evil of the Nazis and also indirectly contributed to the establishment of the State of Israel.
Thank you. That was great. Anthony Pam has got his hand up, but just before he talks, there's some interesting comments here, not really questions. That, I see Stella, her best friend at King David High School was Revelle Penn, the daughter of Jack Penn. Everybody, there are lots of comments about an excellent presentation. And then somebody, Jackie Dana's parents, Jerry and Luth Landsman, were in Haifa in 1948 and 1949. He was a doctor and she a radiographer. So yes, and you mentioned Helfert. Well, Dave Helfert was in my class at medical school, the son of Helfert.
Right.
I remember him being so proud of his father. Okay, so and there's lots of comments about your research and the various things you've said, Naomi. So Anthony, just unmute yourself and what do you have to say?
I think I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
A lot of the World War II Jewish soldiers are commemorated by bits of metal hung from ribbons, which are often not very well preserved and often not well preserved in a Jewish context, but they are there, and anyone who has any such are admonished to kind of indulge in proper preservation efforts. One advantage of the South African awards, which were basically British Empire awards with two South African medals added, is that most were officially named. So we'll have the recipient's name on it. The recipients can be researched at the UDF archives, and there's two different sets of service papers which should be requested. One is the service record, and the other is the medal card, which also records all the person's various postings throughout the war, which can provide a lot of information. Some can be surprising. I once researched a set to a local gentleman, not of the Jewish community, and I didn't want to tell his daughter that he was hospitalized for a social disease, which showed up on the record card. But that sort of thing happens. The Russians can be researched now. Records of Russian Jews available in Russia, and the decorations can be researched. I've done that. Anyone who wants information on medals and awards, you're looking at someone who's an expert in the field and who can also has a particular interest in those of related to Israel, the land, and Jewish recipients in general. There were the Palestinian volunteers as well. That's another subject on its own, which has been written up perhaps more in Hebrew than in English, but you can get information. There's the book South Africans 800 by Henry Katzev, which deals with the South African Machal volunteers. So people who are interested can dig up both published information and archival information. My best solution or suggestion for the archival information is using a private researcher, because if you can give them a name and well, very importantly also a service number, they should be able to turn up the service record of the person in question. Not always, but mainly. And the charges are not relatively too expensive to do so. I'm not punting for any researcher, but I've used that extensively in researching medals in my own collection. So, that resource is available. And, it's a worldwide field of Jews who served in the military worldwide. And, anyone who has any of this memorabilia in their possession is, as I said, originally admonished to preserve it well and preserve it in a Jewish context. And sometimes the Jewish context is not well preserved, and it's just history that's being lost. I end with a terrible story of a British Jewish dealer who went to Israel a long time ago, advertised in the Russian Jewish press for awards. Russian immigrants who were hard up poured into his hotel with room with Russian awards to Jewish recipients for World War II. Russian awards aren't named but have a number, and they have a related document which has the number and the name on it. And they were saying to the interpreter, "Do you want the orders book or the medal book?" And the interpreter was saying to them in Russian, "No." And the British dealer only discovered it halfway through when he purchased a lot of medals and the related documents had just been lost and gone home. So preserving paperwork is important as well.
Absolutely.
Thank
You're
you
quite
very
correct, Anthony. I always ask people, if you've got medals, look at the back because the service number is there in the name. And you can apply to the archives in Pretoria to get it done. If anyone wants the name, there are a few people that do it for a fee. Then they'll photostat the documents for you and send them. Unfortunately, though, just one thing on the documents, they give you postings, but they don't really tell you what the soldiers did. So they'll tell you they left Durban, they went to Suez, they got off in Suez and then went and fought in the Western Desert Campaign, but it doesn't really tell you that. And unfortunately, with the prisoners of war, there really isn't very much, but there are lists where you can find the prisoners of war. There's lists of the Italian prisoners, those who were put into Italian camps, those who were put into German camps, and there were also questionnaires that are available. You can get them in England, of those when they were repatriated at the end of the war, to get their questionnaires that they filled out.
Thanks. Is it okay if I put your email in the chat?
Yeah, so it's the
Naomi,
Rapeport chat.
so that we can, if anybody wants to contact you, I'm
Please.
sure there might just be name. Okay,
Yeah,
I'll write
because
it right
the
away.
thing is to have to put as much information as you can about the soldiers, if you can. Some people don't really know, but it doesn't matter as long as we commemorate them, because we have an idea exactly what battles were fought, what actually happened to the soldiers, that.
Right.
I could add something.
Yeah. There, I've just written it. Oh no, I've written it to. Okay, sorry.
The South Africans who fought in the Israeli Independence War were entitled to the Independence War ribbon and also a little metal emblem called the Ale State of Israel Fighters Award. Not all of them received it. Some received nothing because they weren't contactable or findable. Some only received the ribbon, but not the State Fighters Award. I actually conducted a little campaign a few years ago to try and bring to the attention of the public, all those who were veterans or relatives of deceased veterans, that there was eligibility for these awards. So if anyone is related to a Machalnik and there are not two awards surviving in family possession, I'm just giving the heads up that they should go after whatever is missing, and they should go through the Israeli embassy and the defense attaché, whatever. There's a service ribbons unit in Israel who also would deal with this. It's another way of commemorating history and also honoring the memory of those who served as Machalniks.
Thank you.
Those little emblems deserve to be put into family possession or recipient and be preserved properly. So that's just another little note.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. Just wanted to read what Nati Finkelstein wrote, and I think that if there aren't more questions after that, we can probably, we can end this meeting. What a fantastic, interesting, and thoroughly researched account. Many thanks for sharing this with us. It makes one proud to be a South African Jew. The selfless devotion of our fellow South Africans to perform military and medical duties in Israel during the early formation of the state is indeed laudable. So thank you so much for that, Nati. And I think that, we can Once again, Naomi, thank you so much. We'll
you.
meet again next week for our next seminar. And we, encourage you to browse through our CHOL website. There are lots of new developments there all the time, memoirs, communities, etc. At website called, what is it, Geraldine, you know it off by heart, the website address. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, it's CHOL.website.
Okay, there you go. Okay, I'll remember that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you, Naomi. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Gail, for
Pleasure.
organizing and running this lovely meeting. It was
Thank you.
very, very fascinating, Naomi. Thank you.
I
Thank
know.
you. Pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah,
And if
yeah.
anyone has any
Very,
queries of
Thank you all.
soldiers or names, please send it to us so we can have a
Okay.
comprehensive list of the South Africans and commemorate them. Thank you.
Thank you
It's
very
very
much.
unique work you're doing. Very unique and special work, Naomi.
Thank you.
We can help
Thank you.
you. We're always happy to do that.
Thanks very
Okay.
much. Good. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Good
Bye.
night. Bye.